Welcome everyone back to the Hub. Today's guest is Dirk Lindeman. Dirk works at a major pharmaceutical company. He's also my father-in-law, so this will be good. I guess if I butcher the interview, then we'll see how Christmas and next family gathering.
You'll do well, don't worry.
Dirk, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Yeah.
Hi, so my name is Dirk Lindeman. As Matt mentioned, I do work in the pharmaceutical industry. To be clear, I'm not an authoritative expert. So anything that I do share today should be cross-checked with authoritative sources. But working in the industry, I am familiar with the process and the work that's going on there. So I'm excited to talk with Matt, share a little bit about that industry and what's currently underway, particularly with regards to COVID vaccines.
Yeah, thanks, Dirk. And as readers or listeners might have guessed, today's episode and real focus is about drug development, vaccines in particular, just given the COVID environment. And vaccines have been in the news quite a bit. Kamala Harris was asked, would she take a vaccine? And she said if Donald Trump said to, she wouldn't. But if Dr. Fauci said to, she would. But before we dive into, politics and current stuff, maybe Dirk, could you walk us through, and I know we talked a little bit about this, but could you walk us through how drugs get developed, how vaccine gets developed, and then kind of what technologies are being used? Or what efforts, what does it take to develop a new drug?
Okay, so great question. So we'll just talk about how the process works to begin with. So most drug development begins in what they call drug discovery labs, where biologists and chemists will study diseases, and they'll try and identify molecular entities, either they create them or identify them, that actually can initiate a positive effect in our biochemical systems to counteract or eliminate diseases or other health problems we may face. And so it often begins with that sort of discovery work there. Once a promising molecular entity, and they usually divide them into what you could call small molecules and large molecules. Small molecules are small chemicals that can be usually put into pills. Large molecules are like biologics that you often have to receive through an injection. But once they've discovered what looks to be a promising chemical entity or biological entity, it will then go into what's called preclinical testing. And that's where they will test it on cells in, you could say in petri dishes and labs, but then they will also test it in animals, mice, monkeys, other animals from time to time, to verify that it is safe and that it triggers the sort of immune response or response that they would like. So all that testing is done. That preclinical testing precedes any testing within humans. And once yes, go ahead.
How long does that process normally take?
It really can vary depending on the disease and the chemical entity, anywhere from a few months to years sometimes. So it really does vary depending on the kind of chemical and disease it is. But it does take a while.
Yeah.
And then once they feel it's ready for human testing and it's past those hurdles, and a lot of possible new medicines get eliminated because they don't either trigger the response you're expecting or they prove to be unsafe. It won't even get to human testing, but once it does, it'll begin what's called clinical testing, and there are 3 phases of clinical testing. So phase 1, 2, and 3. So phase 1 clinical testing is really just about safety. So they'll usually take healthy adults, and usually just 1 to 2 dozen, just a few, and they will administer the drug carefully monitored to make sure that there's no negative reactions of any sort. And with vaccines, they also may test a little bit to see if there's an immune response, or there starts to be one, but it's primarily about safety in phase 1. Assuming that everything goes well with that phase 1 trial, it will then go into what's called phase 2. Now, phase 2 is where they usually will test maybe one to a couple hundred participants. It varies depending on what's needed to prove what they're testing in that phase. But in phase 2, that's when you continue to test safety. Actually, all 3 phases, you're always checking safety.
Right.
But that's where you also begin to test it more completely for its efficacy, as they call it, or its ability to actually trigger the health benefit that you would like. And in phase 2, you often then have multiple arms of the study. So you may have a placebo arm or a standard of care arm. So you can do comparisons, right? You then may have several different doses if you're not sure which dose is optimal. So you may be testing the drug at different doses in different arms as well. And that's all going on in phase 2 to get a preliminary data about efficacy, which dosage it would be ideal, and then always you're testing safety.
And just, I mean, this should be fairly obvious for people, but in case it isn't, a placebo, right? That's important because, you know, sometimes people, if they take a pill, they think, oh, I'm going to get better. And that's important to distinguish between, oh, you know, mentally or psychologically, they're like thinking they're going to get better versus like actually getting better. And so the placebo would help differentiate between like, I guess maybe you should correct me if I'm wrong, but placebo differentiates between, okay, yeah, the pill actually worked. We can tell the people that got a pill and people that didn't get a pill and see the different results between the two.
That's right. That's right. And it is, I think, important to note that, you know, in these clinical trials, particularly phase 2 and 3, everything's what they call double blind, which means the patient and the doctor or healthcare practitioner who's administering the product, both of them don't know if what they're getting in terms of placebo or different doses. They don't know, and that's important to ensure the statistical integrity of the actual study results.
Yeah, you know, I'm glad you brought that up because I was reading just yesterday, Johnson & Johnson, they have a vaccine in development, and I think they're in phase 3 trials, but
right.
The CEO was like, I don't even know if it was the placebo or the real drug. And for me, I was like, well, how could the CEO not know? So one of the participants got sick or something happened. And I guess that makes sense now why the CEO wouldn't have known at that time whether it was a placebo or whether it was the actual.
Right. We'll talk about that case a little bit later, but it's very strictly controlled. So the individuals who know, it's an extremely small set of people, usually the biostatisticians within a pharmaceutical company, who actually know what's been administered and not. And it's very, very carefully controlled. So frankly, even most people in the company itself, even doing the trial itself, don't know. It's very important for integrity of the data. And one thing that I know the pharmaceutical company takes very seriously as they do their work.
Okay, great. Well, what about, so let's say you've passed through preclinical, phase 1, phase 2. Now what's phase 3?
So assuming everything goes well with phase 2, phase 3 is where you expand to a very large clinical trial. Now we're usually talking on the order of thousands to tens of thousands of patients. And you may still be doing some dose studies, but mostly it's about really proving the efficacy on a large scale, as well as ensuring safety on a large scale. So sometimes you have to go to thousands of patients to be able to catch sort of rare side effects that can be dangerous, but you're also trying to prove on a large scale that it really does have a benefit. And particularly with vaccines, that usually does require very large studies. So, you know, you look at most of the COVID vaccine studies underway now that are in phase 3, you're talking on the order of 10,000, 30,000 or more patients they need to enroll to be able to ensure that they have statistically significant results that can prove or disprove the efficacy and safety of those drugs. So, that ties a little bit into why it can be so expensive to do drug development, is because the government regulations and the standards of the industry require very large studies in phase 3 to prove both safety and efficacy.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up kind of the cost side of things, because do participants get paid? Is this kind of a voluntary thing, kind of like I want to further the cause of science, or like how do participants get signed up?
So I'm not an expert on this at all, and this is one area where I'll defer a little bit, but there is compensation, I believe, provided to certainly the doctors and institutions which perform these trials, right? As well, I think to a certain degree, the patients as well. But exactly what that looks like and how that's decided is not a part of the industry I'm familiar with.
Gotcha. And then if you don't know these figures either, that's okay. But what's the percentage of drugs that get started preclinical, future dish to phase 1, phase 2? Like, what's the success rate?
So yeah, it's a very steep funnel, right?
I can imagine.
From drug discovery all the way to clinical. I do know a little bit about that. So the Tufts Institution or Center for Study of Drug Development published a report in the May 2019 Journal of Health Economics. And by their calculations, it now costs roughly $2.6 billion to develop one new drug. Now, that's fully loaded, factoring on all the losses, right? Because you have to factor in that much, but it still is very expensive. And the success rate for this is from preclinical, assuming it gets to clinical, it starts clinical, right? And
Yep.
What makes it all the way to actually an approved product is about 12%. So 88%, or actually like 7 out of 8,
Wow.
that go into clinical development. They make it even that far and start clinical development. Only 1 of 8, roughly, is going to make it all the way to actually an approved product.
Well, and you bring up a good point. Like those 7 that don't make it to the approved product, you're still spending, the pharmaceutical industry, the company is still spending lots of money just even getting it, trying to advance it to each phase.
Oh, right. Depending on where it fails, and it has to be stopped, but it will cost more if it fails in phase 3 versus phase 1, correct? Right. But still, there is cost, and often very sizable cost to to these failures. And there's quite a few that get to phase 3 but never actually prove efficacious. And so the company eats all those costs for those failed efforts. So it's very expensive. I mean, there is some arguing, I think, about the exact number. I know there was a report by the Office of Health Economics in 2012 that said about $1.5 billion. That's 8 years ago. But nevertheless, it costs billions, right? A lot of money to bring new products to market, and therefore not cheap.
All right. So I'll hold off on more questions on costs, because I want to ask you about how other countries can get cheaper drug rates and things like that. But that's more in the purchasing of it. Going back to like phase 3, phase 3 of the drug development. That sounds like that's one of the most expensive part of drug development. Getting people signed up, monitoring it. You have to pay people to monitor the results, administer all that stuff.
Correct.
So the US, right, with regards to COVID, they have like how many drugs, how many vaccines are currently being developed for COVID?
So yeah, let's talk about COVID, because that's obviously of prime interest to the entire world right now. And to give credit where it's due, a site I really like to follow this is the New York Times has a coronavirus tracker site, which I would recommend if people want to dive into the nitty-gritty details here. But they do a good job of tracking what's happening worldwide. And right now, per their website, there are 45 different vaccine candidates in development that are in clinical and 91 in preclinical. So there's well over 100 different, you could say, possible vaccines that are in development now, which is unprecedented to have this large of a number, but it's such a large problem that you could also argue it's not surprising. And so there's, a lot of effort being put into trying to develop a vaccine for, for COVID.
So, okay, so do you feel, has there been, because normally vaccines take, how long do they take normally to develop from like start to finish?
Multiple years. Often usually like 2 to 3 is usually the fastest, to often it's not surprising to take a decade or more. And I think it's important to point out that while I will say this, vaccines typically have a higher success rate in that drug development funnel than you could say pills for different medical conditions. Nevertheless, there's no guarantee that a vaccine can be developed for any given virus. For example, right, HIV, which causes AIDS, has been, there have been efforts for several decades now to develop a vaccine for it because it's a virus. Yet because of the nature of that virus, there isn't a successful vaccine yet. So it is a real challenge in some cases to develop a vaccine, and no guarantee. I think in this case, everyone's cheering for each other because we all want a vaccine, and probably multiple vaccines that prove effective in fighting this disease to meet the worldwide need for it. But, it typically takes a lot longer than the speed at which the entire, pharmaceutical and governmental world is working to try and get these vaccines developed and approved.
So has it been more of a higher priority focus, kind of like getting, I don't want to say fast approving because I don't want to put any doubt or credibility to the process of getting a vaccine, but I'm surely some people have had that concern, like, man, these vaccines seem to have really come really quick. Like, how can we be safe? And then, a second question is like, Russia supposedly already has a vaccine, is already injected, given it to their populace. Same with China. Did those vaccines shortchange the process, or is that part of phase 3? Like what's going on over there?
Well, good question. I would say generally for the developed world, right, both the government agencies who regulate drug approval and the industry itself have a strongly vested interest in ensuring safety and efficacy before a drug is made available to the public, right? It's in nobody's interest to accelerate so fast that products are brought to market that prove to be unsafe or don't work. Right. So there's a strong commitment, I think, on both sides here, both the industry and the governmental agencies, to ensure, despite political pressure, to ensure that the bars for safety and efficacy are met before anything's approved. Now, I think we know in the U.S. They do allow emergency use authorization if the early data is very positive. That could allow some to be released, but typically even then, in that case, it's only to high risk, high priority individuals. It's not going to be made generally available to the public. So, because usually you have to wait, while there are checks of the data during the course of a trial, particularly phase 3, to see how it's performing. So if you need to shut it down early, you do, or if it looks still positive, you keep it going, but you don't normally file for approval and get approval until you have your full proper set of data according to your protocol that was approved to do that clinical trial. So there may be some emergency use authorization, but trust me, the industry and the governmental agencies are regulated, and most countries are going to follow the process, even though they're going to pull out all the, they're going to accelerate it as much as they can. They're not going to lower the bar.
Right.
And what happened, particularly, I think, in the case of Russia and China, is there were a couple vaccines developed in their countries that had some early, I think, phase 2 results, if I'm not mistaken, that looked positive. And they just decided to approve it for availability based on that, which doesn't meet the bar, frankly, in most of the rest of the world. And they're not happy about it. But, obviously, if governments choose to do so, they can authorize it. It just doesn't meet the bar, I think, in what most of the world would say is needed before it should be made available to the general public.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can understand the incentive for a government leader, right?
Absolutely.
The vaccine, I've saved the world, so, but you also want to make sure the vaccine's safe. And then
Right.
with regards to the emergency use, that's what happened when President Trump got sick. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what I read was that some of the treatments he was given were emergency authorization was given for some of the drugs that he received.
Yeah, in certain cases, it can be authorized for use. I know in the case of cancer, right? If the diagnosis is they're likely to die, and there's nothing that can be done, then some drugs that are still in development can be authorized compassionate use to allow them to try it, given they have no other alternatives. So, there are exceptions that are made, but I think as a general rule of thumb, the government and the industry is going to hold a very high bar for what these vaccines need to meet before they're going in terms of that both safety and efficacy, before they would be approved for availability to the general public.
Yeah, and you could bring up a good point. Like, there's a difference between someone who's gonna die or compassionate use, like emergency one-off versus widespread.
Right.
Making it available for everyone. So that's a good point. So there was a question. So there's a company, I forget the name of them, but in the UK, it's also part of the Oxford study. I think it's AstraZeneca or some company like that. They're in phase 3 and they paused their vaccine study because someone got sick. And then I think it was maybe Nancy Pelosi saying like, well, UK, they might not meet the standards for US, vaccine development. That doesn't really seem, it seems like in the developed world, the standards are all pretty the same. Pretty
For the
simple.
most part, they are. I mean, there are occasional differences of opinion or regulation, right, even among highly developed countries like the US and UK. But by and large, the standards are the same.
Gotcha.
And we can talk about that when we talk about the different major candidates that are out there for COVID.
Well, let's go ahead and dive in, because and maybe you could give a little background on like the technology. I know we talked about this a little bit, but I think others would find it interesting. Like, so the RNDA or something like that. There's the
right. So there's
my depth here. So
right, there's different, you could say, technologies or biotechnologies that are being explored with some of these different vaccine candidates. And, again, referencing the New York Times website here, the first, you could say, wave, or the ones that are most likely to come out earliest, fall into the category of what you call genetic vaccines. So they basically deliver the coronavirus's own genes into our cells to provoke an immune response. And probably the two most prominent candidates that we've heard about in the news in this space are the Moderna and NIH vaccine and the Pfizer BioNTech Fosun Pharma vaccine, both of which are in phase 3 or phase 2/3, and are the most likely to get early approval, assuming they meet the safety and efficacy hurdles. Both of these are based off of messenger RNA technology.
That's what it is.
Moderna's vaccine is in phase 3 with 30,000 participants now. And the Pfizer BioNTech one is in what's a combination phase 2-3. Sometimes pharmaceutical companies are allowed to combine a couple phases. They went into phase 2-3 with 30,000 in July, and in September they actually upped that to 43,000. So those are the timeline. I think for Pfizer, they may have some early data by the end of October, although they wouldn't really file for approval from what I saw until November.
Yeah.
Moderna probably won't have enough data to submit for approval until I think November, December, if I recall correctly. So, but before the end of the year, both of them have the potential to have enough data to submit for, you could say that, emergency use authorization.
Sorry, let me add one point here too. I saw that Pfizer November's earliest that they're trying to shoot for. And in terms of, I think the government has, provided a lot of this funding to help pay for, the development and whatnot. And so I think I read something that, they're Moderna, maybe it was Moderna or Pfizer, were going to price the drug such in a way that reflected the taxpayer or the government subsidy in the development of the drug. In other words, this isn't just like Pfizer bearing alone the cost of development. Taxpayers have also stepped in. The federal government stepped in, gave them a grant to help try and develop this drug.
Right. So I'm not familiar with the details of those negotiations, but I know there has been many of those between these pharmaceutical companies and the governments regarding funding to help their research. And also, I would say funding to pre-manufacture large quantities. So typically, a pharmaceutical company will wait until phase 3 trials are done and they're positive to produce large quantities, right? Who would do that if it might fail and you wouldn't have a product to sell? But given the great need, governments are providing funding, or they've actually, I know in the case of many of the US and some other major, the EU, other major governments have actually already pre-approved funding for research and also for doses of a certain quantity. I think the US, from what I saw, committed $1.5 billion in August for 100 million doses of Moderna's vaccine. They committed 1.9 billion for 100 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine, assuming it meets the bar, right? And an option for 500 million more. I think Japan and EU both made commitments for hundreds of millions of doses for the Pfizer vaccine as well. So I'm sure there'll be some negotiations about what the price is to the government that were included in that, given they're helping fund at risk the manufacturing of these, so that once it is approved, large doses could be made available immediately. Right. I know that, but that also means that those governments or those countries that are doing so are probably going to get the first wave of manufacturing of doses available. So it does, because they're funding it, they're going to get first access to these. Whereas the developing world, unfortunately, in these cases, right, they'll get it secondarily because these large, developed countries have provided the funding up front to get them made and get it available.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that scene from, what's that movie? Pandemic? No, it's not. Contagion. My wife and I watched it recently when once the lockdown happened, and it's like the very end, they hold a WHO worker hostage because they're like, we need it. This is a poor, I guess it was, anyways, it was a country, and it's like, yeah, like these things take time. It takes a lot of money to develop and also to manufacture, distribute. Like this isn't just like drop of the bucket kind of thing. So
right.
I also want to say, I think in the US, 9 of the CEOs from the major pharmaceutical companies signed a joint letter saying that they wouldn't release any vaccine before it passed all hurdles, all standards, and like they wouldn't rush this development. And so essentially, like, even though government's made it a fast track and pharmaceutical companies is high priority, like, I think there was a letter signed by a CEO saying, like, you know, we won't release this until, you know, all the boxes are checked, kind of thing.
Right, and that just shows, I think, the commitment on the part of the industry, as well as, you know, certainly most of the developed world's government agencies, to ensure that you know, these new vaccines meet the bars of safety and efficacy before they're made available to the public.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious, you know, what the libertarian perspective, because for me, like, from a big government, this seems like a good role for the government to play, funding this, you know, get these vaccine developed, you know, help pay for the cost of manufacturing and distributing it, like, in the development. It seems like a good role for the government to play, to kind of step in and help out. But you don't need to comment on that, you know. But just thinking out loud, like, you know, I wonder what the counter argument would be for, you know, this seems like a pretty good win-win scenario between private and public, you know.
Well, right, and I think in certain crises like this is, right, it's important that there be a partnership, private and public, to address the health issue that certainly is of you know, great concern to all of us.
Yeah, well, and it's like government's job is to protect people and the property and life and things like that. So,
Right.
the other thing for the messenger
RNA.
RNA, that, thank you. This is like a new technology, right?
Yeah, it's largely new, so that's why you know, some of these technologies that are being used, you can more quickly bring them to clinical studies and testing, like messenger RNA, but you know, they haven't really been used for, at least to my knowledge, in any major vaccine that's available today. So it's a bit unproven, right? I think we're all, again, cheering, that hoping not one but many vaccine candidates actually are successful. But you know, this is a bit unproven. But it's the first wave, and it's the one most likely to come first, particularly these two, you know, candidates. So I think when you're talking about what we're likely to see first, in terms of results, one way or the other, it would be from Moderna and Pfizer. In a big way. And then there are smaller players, government agencies, smaller companies that are doing compounds too. But I'm focusing in my comments here on the major pharmaceutical companies that have contracts with governments, that have also a history of developing vaccines, and therefore more likely to deliver a successful candidate.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the first wave, those genetic vaccines from Moderna and Pfizer. Sort of the next wave is what you would call they call viral vector vaccines. So these are vaccines that contain viruses that have been engineered to kind of carry coronavirus genes. And actually the two vaccine candidates in China and Russia that were approved for early use fall into this category. Again, they've only had some early phase 2 data, so they don't really meet the bar for efficacy and safety yet for most of the rest of the world, but they fall in this category. But the ones that I think there's a couple of candidates that are most likely to be the next wave that look potentially positive. So the first one is by Johnson & Johnson, that we've heard about, and they have an engineered adenovirus. Again, I think an engineered adenovirus is a bit of new technology as well. They are in phase 3. They recently paused, as you heard just a few days ago, due to an adverse reaction. And it's not terribly unusual that can happen when you're doing large trials. And what they have to do is investigate to ensure that reaction wasn't caused by the virus, or determine if it was.
Right.
And that can stop a whole program if it's determined that it does, or it may have been unrelated to the vaccine. So, you know, there is some, you know, they are paused for the moment, but they have major contracts with the US and EU as well for, you know, hundreds of millions of doses, assuming they get approved. Probably the other major engineered adenovirus candidate in this sort of second wave is by AZ and Oxford,
Right.
University of Oxford, which I know has been in the news too. And they also had an adverse reaction in September that caused their trial to be paused. I think they determined in the UK anyway that it was not related to the vaccine. So they, they resumed the trial in most of the rest of the world. I actually think the patients in the US on that trial, though, are still on pause. That they chose to, the FDA in the US wasn't quite satisfied with all the investigation. So that's my understanding of where it is now. But that also, Canada has received contracts for large doses, assuming it's successful.
Mhm.
But again, they both the J&J compound and the AZ Oxford compound um, are using an engineered adenovirus, which also is relatively new in the vaccine world as far as the technology. I think a couple of other interesting ones just to mention that are in phase one or about to start phase one are a couple that Merck is working on. Merck's a company that's done a lot of work in vaccines for decades. They have a candidate from a company called Themis that they acquired that actually uses a weakened measles virus engineered with a gene for the coronavirus spike protein. And their belief is, measles, mumps, rubella vaccines have been around for, 50, 60 years
Very successful.
and a very successful platform, so they believe it has a strong likelihood of success. And I think that also could be single dose because some of these vaccines would require, even if they are successful, may require multiple doses. And obviously adherence and is always better if you can administer it in a single dose.
Totally.
That's one that they have. They have another one with IAVI that they're about to start phase one with that's actually based off the same virus technology that was used for their successful Ebola vaccine. And this one was very interesting, I think, because they're engineering this one so it actually could be, it's a vaccine that you could take as a pill. So, when you think about medicines, you not only have to think about its safety and efficacy, but the way in which you can administer it also can make a big difference. And for a vaccine that we need worldwide, if it's able to be administered in a pill format, that would be far superior than having to give injections. Because sometimes those have to be refrigerated, and you can imagine in developing countries being able to keep vaccines refrigerated isn't so easy. So we'll see how that goes, right? It's very early on and they wouldn't have data till probably mid next year. But those are a couple of other interesting candidates based on proven platforms that are also being worked on. I think one final platform that's interesting to talk about is the protein-based vaccines. Now, this also is relatively new. These are vaccines that contain coronavirus proteins, but no genetic material. And Novavax has one candidate that's in phase 3. It just entered phase 3 in September, where they stick the proteins into microscopic particles. It does have a contract with the US, but it's also a fairly new platform, so we'll see if it's successful. Also, another major player that's got a protein-based vaccines is Sanofi GSK. That's actually two different pharmaceutical companies that have partnered. Both of them have long histories in vaccines. And they began phase 1/2 in September, but they also have contracts signed with the US, EU, and Canada if their candidate proves to be successful. So you can see in these different sort of technology areas, there's a number of candidates that are being worked on. And, we all hope that many of them are successful so that we all can have potential vaccines available to us to help combat this pandemic.
Yeah. I kind of feel like the sentiment, like the economy, the world kind of won't go back to, full interaction, kind of more back to normal until I feel like there's a vaccine readily available. You gotta, people need to feel confident that they can be safe, they're going to be healthy, just normal interaction. And I feel like until a vaccine makes its way widely available, that
Right.
we're still going to be in some constrained or diminished capacity, I feel like. But
Right.
that's just me reading the news and kind of seeing how people interact and things like that. So
Well, right. Until we have, and this doesn't even touch on some other work that's going on in the industry regarding new treatments for treating the disease once you get it.
yeah.
Right. So there are efforts underway to not just develop vaccines, but also treatments should someone get the disease to be able to minimize the serious effects of it. So, I know we're not touching on that here, but there are a lot of efforts in that regard as well.
Yeah, it seems like there's, as you went through the list, I didn't realize how much, work and how many vaccines are being developed. You hear about the major ones, Pfizer, Moderna, and the one from the UK, but yeah, it seems like there's quite a few, being developed here. So it's good.
Well, yeah, 45 are in clinical development and 91 in preclinical. So there's a lot that's being done, and I think that's a good sign that the world's taking this very seriously, and they're really working hard. A lot of very dedicated healthcare leaders, scientists are putting their heart and soul into trying to deliver treatments and vaccines that will help get us back to normal.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty awesome, pretty cool work, and I think the world hopefully will be grateful, and for things that come out. So I guess kind of wrapping things up here a little bit. So let's say one of these drugs makes it to market, and government leaders, whoever it might be, whether it's Biden, Trump, Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, whoever, if they say, hey, we got this drug, you should take it, it sounds like you'd be pretty confident, kind of knowing the process, that, hey, this vaccine has made it through all these, different stages, it's been, fully vetted, like it should be okay. Like you wouldn't have any concerns taking a vaccine.
I would personally, I wouldn't if it was approved by the FDA, the regulatory authorities that approve these vaccine candidates, right? I wouldn't listen to any politician really on that. It's really the scientists.
That's true.
It's the FDA that really should make those decisions based on a well-established set of safety and efficacy parameters that they've been using for many years, decades now. So if they review the results from these vaccines, from any one of these candidates, and say it's met our bar for safety and efficacy, then personally I wouldn't have any concern with taking it.
So people need to keep their eye really more on the FDA, and the New York Times has a good up-to-date information on the vaccines.
Yeah, they have a great coronavirus tracker. You can Google search it. You can go and read what largely I shared just now on the different candidates and where they're at. And they keep it current, so they're constantly refreshing it and updating it so you can see the latest on where any one of these candidates stand.
Yeah, I've used the New York Times and the Washington Post for like tracking cases, but I didn't really know about the vaccine vaccine tracker that the New York Times is doing. So that is helpful.
Right. And there are other sources out there too. It's just one that I find useful and one that I leveraged for our discussion today. But there are other sites out there that also have information about these various vaccine candidates. And again, I'm not an expert on this, so I would refer anybody who listens to this who really has a deep interest to do your own homework and do your own research on these different candidates.
Great. All right. Well, I guess thanks, Dirk, for coming on. One last question, and it's more of just final thought that as you've talked through the process, like a lot of times people complain drug prices are so high, and I kind of hope, I guess maybe not a question, I hope there's maybe a little bit more understanding of what it takes to get a drug to market. To start from an idea, whether it's small molecule or large molecule, to get it to being widely distributed. That's a huge process. Costs what, 8.2 billion was one figure thrown out.
2.6, right?
Okay. Well,
Right.
what's a few billion amongst friends, right? No. That in a way that a lot of times that we allow pharmaceutical companies to recoup that investment is we give them, the sole rights, the patent for 5 years or whatever to, hey, you're the only one that can produce this drug. And obviously that gives them a lot of pricing power. And I guess it's a different question is like, how much did it cost to develop? They got to recoup those losses. They also have to make a profit to fund future development of drugs.
Right.
So, and then after the 5 years or 10 years or whenever the patent expires, then other companies can make that drug as well.
Yeah, so I think it's worthwhile to take a couple of minutes to talk about this, because I think there's a very big misunderstanding in much of the world about drug pricing, right? And part of that's driven by a couple of bad actors
Yep.
In the industry.
Who is the guy that went to jail that was like kind of like a younger guy, kind of crazy?
Martin Shkreli, right? Usually it's very small pharma companies that have a niche product, or what they sometimes call an orphan drug, meaning that it's the only drug for a particular disease, but it's a very rare disease or uncommon disease, right? So there's no incentive for multiple companies to develop the same drug when there's just a very limited number of patients who would need it. And sometimes when you have a monopoly like that, you could say you have a bad actor who then decides to raise the prices to some exorbitant amount. Right. And that gets a lot of press, a lot of the negativity, and it should for that particular company that does that, right? That really is
abusing
their pricing, I think, as anyone would imagine. But I would say for the major pharmaceutical companies and for the vast majority of the industry, they, as you can understand, because of the very high cost of drug development and the regulations only get tougher, they've never gotten easier over time, pretty much. And as well as increasing inflation, it's very, very expensive to fund good quality research to bring new drugs that make a difference in people's lives to market. And as most of the world is covered by patent laws. So it's important to remember that when a patent's filed for usually a new drug, it's right when the chemical's first discovered and made in the lab, way back in the discovery pipeline. And so it's often 5-10 years or so from when it was discovered and the patent was filed until it actually, assuming it makes it all the way through, it gets approved as a product. And most patents are for 20 years. So that means that the company only has a short window of time, maybe 10 years or so, to actually recoup all the money it invested and make a little profit to invest in the next generation of products, right? So that's part of the reason that branded new drugs that are still in patent do cost more. I think what's important to point out, though, is the differences in the way some countries manage this. So the U.S. is a market in which branded drugs, they're often, it's more free market. Companies are given more freedom to set their own pricing. But the U.S. is also a place based on those free market principles where once a drug goes generic, the costs go dramatically down. I mean, the sales curve is like a cliff nowadays because generic companies are waiting. And literally the day that it's off, they and their pharmaceutical, their insurance companies are going to switch you over to the generic version of it. Right. So the U.S. is actually a country in which, brand prices are high, but generic prices are, just barely above cost. And it's important to note the fact that, and I looked this up, if you go to like the Statista website, they have a chart of how many prescriptions in the U.S. are for generic drugs versus branded. And if you go back to 2005, about 50% of the prescriptions were generics, and there's 10% which are called branded generics. So they're still branded, but they're more at a generic price.
Right.
And then 40% were branded. So that's 15 years ago. According to their data, just last year, 2019, 86% of the prescriptions filled in the US were generics, for generic products, 4% for branded, and only 10% were for branded products. So the reality is in the US, 90% of the prescriptions that are filled are for generics or branded generic products, which are going to be very, very, much less expensive. And only 10%, because there's so many good generic treatments out there. Yeah. Branded actually is a very small part of the market out there. But when you look at other countries outside the US, they often have a different strategy to pricing. So they will often negotiate and require pharmaceutical companies to come in with a lower price, even for a branded product, than what it costs in the US. But once it goes generic, it really doesn't change a whole lot in price. So, in the US, we get you could say the high and low of more of a free market approach to pricing for our drugs. Whereas in most other countries worldwide, it's very controlled by the government. So yes, the branded price for a new drug may be less than what it is in the US, and which is why you hear calls for let's import from Canada or other countries. Right. But when you look at after the patent expires, the price will not usually drop anywhere close to what it does in the US, because they're helping keep that pharmaceutical company, they're helping make up for the lower price of the branded when it was first released by allowing the ongoing, and once it becomes generic, price to be higher. So there's different approaches, and a lot of people in the world don't realize that, to how pricing's done in different countries.
That's good. I didn't know that. I knew that countries like Canada or India, the government will negotiate directly with pharmaceutical company and get it. So they have a lot more buying power, saying, hey, if you want to sell to people of India, this is the price that you have to sell it. I didn't realize on the tail end, once the drug rolls off, patent, like the price, like you said, falls dramatically. And so in the US, it's pretty cheap, but in India and these other places, Canada, the price stays the same. So they don't get the lower cost once it rolls off.
Well, I'm not an expert on it. This is from what people I've worked with have told me, and it will vary country to country. I'm sure there's some drop, but my understanding is that it's not as dramatic as what you see in the US, right? Where it's much more free market. Now, that doesn't mean that, like the US government, right, it insures a large number of US citizens through its Medicare and Medicaid programs. So it still has a lot of negotiating power with pharmaceutical companies, even though it's more free market based. It still has a lot of negotiating power. And I will say this: I know, pretty much all the major pharmaceutical companies, they also are committed to patients receiving their medications. They want people who need their products to get them. And so for people who have who can't afford it, they often have patient assistance programs. So I would encourage anyone, if you feel that you are unable to get a pharmaceutical product, particularly a branded one, that the price is an issue there, go to that company. They have patient assistance programs, and look to enroll in one of those, and they will oftentimes be able to help you be able to get your needed product at a price you can afford. But again, 90% of the prescriptions that people get nowadays in the US are for generic products, which are already, non-branded. They're off patent. So you should be getting a very good price in the US for almost all the medicines you need.
Dirk, I think that's a great note to end on. So I want to thank you again for taking some time, walking us through, history of drug development, the different technologies, different platforms being used right now to develop COVID vaccines, and kind of just talking healthcare, drug cost. And, I actually, I feel like I've, tried to stay up to date on, the mechanisms, the market economy, and like how drugs being developed. But I've learned, especially with the foreign pricing and drugs, that I learned a lot. So thanks for taking some time and coming on the show.
Oh, sure thing, Matt. Anytime.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, and we'll catch you. I guess we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, will do. Take care.
See ya.